everybody. Welcome to Frontline Dispatches, a program of organizing upgrade where we highlight left campaigns and left battles happening in real time. Don't forget to like us on Facebook. Our guest today is Amara Enyia from Diaspora Rising. Welcome, Amara. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Good to be here.
Great to have you on the show. Well, today we are, as you know, a couple of weeks ago, we saw in the headlines the atrocious treatment of Haitians at the border. But we actually want to really dive in, and this is not something that just happened. You know, I think mainstream media really says like, oh, like this came out of nowhere. And actually there's a long history. So I'd love for you, Amara, to really talk to us about, talk to us, what's the history of U.S. and Haiti and that informs this current moment?
Yeah, so a lot of folks are as you stated, just became aware of the issue in Del Rio a couple of weeks ago. But the reality is that this has been a longstanding issue at the southern border and an issue with U.S. immigration policy, U.S. foreign policy, as well as U.S. domestic policy for quite some time. So we can go all the way back to Haiti and Haiti's independence, and what the implications of winning their independence from France and what that resulted in for the Haitian people. So a lot of times when we think about Haiti, people just think, oh, earthquakes, oh, hurricanes, this and that, lack of stability. Well, a lot of the issues that the country faces stem from U.S. foreign policy toward Haiti. So even upon independence, it has to be noted that Haiti paid France reparations to the tune of what would in today's dollars be $90 billion. Mm-hmm. So when you have that kind of situation that essentially cripples the economy from the outset, again, this is at independence, Haiti was paying these reparations to France for their independence. So it crippled the economy from the outset. And you also had institutions like major financial institutions like Citibank who benefited from those reparations that were paid, that actually used that as a way to profit off of the debt, if you will, that Haiti was paying to France. So you see this collusion not only of the state to cripple Haiti from the beginning, but also institutions like major financial institutions that got in on it and used it as a way of generating profits for themselves. A lot of folks also aren't familiar with the 20-year U.S. occupation of Haiti.
Yes.
So, you know, it's a huge moment in time in Haitian history where the U.S. was engaged in imperialism like many of these other countries. So usually people think about the UK, they think about France when they think about imperialism and colonialism, but the US was very much engaged in that project as well. In Haiti, occupied the country for 20 years.
What years was that? Can you remind us what years was happening?
I believe it was 1922, and I have to double check the exact dates, but it was earlier on during the 1900s. So it's obviously it's not in the present day, but right. The implications of a 20-year occupation are significant, not only on how this represses the people there, but also in having complete control over the economy and making sure that there was a continued extractive economy that was not going to benefit the Haitian people, but would in fact benefit the United States.
Right. Well, just going back to the I have a quote by Gerald Lenoir. He's one of our Frontline Dispatches hosts, and also just recently wrote an article. And he says, Haiti is the first nation in the world to overthrow the shackles of slavery, and the Haitian people have been punished for the victory ever since. And so one of the ways that I was reading that showed up is Black people weren't allowed to come to, free Black people were not allowed to come to the United States in 1804. They passed a law.
Well, yes. I mean, we can go back to the Alien and Sedition Act, which, you know, in the history that we're probably taught in schools in the U.S., there's a completely different way that it's categorized. But there was a lot of concern about Haitians, primarily because of their track record of resistance, because they did, in fact, win their independence. There was fear in the United States of Haitians coming to the U.S., being free and radicalizing Black people in the U.S., They didn't want to, they almost, it was an interesting comparison to almost like an infection that Black people in the US, if Haitians actually came into the country, would infect them with this desire to be free, therefore spreading that sort of revolutionary spirit, of course, which already existed in the US, but this was the concern that free Black people from Haiti would come and spread that sense of freedom and the desire to be free to Black people that were on US territory. And so you had things like the Alien and Sedition Act that were done, and it's one of the earliest mechanisms to limit Black people from coming into the United States. And that's where the focus on not just our foreign policy, but our domestic policy, and how from the very beginning it has been anti-Black. And it's represented in some of those early laws, and it's represented, unfortunately, in our present laws.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we try to highlight in the show is like, you know, let's make sure that people understand what is this history of imperialism. When we're talking about, you know, immigrants, make sure that that context is present. I think with Haiti, it's a very direct line, so it's not like random, you know. And in terms of the role the U.S. has played, so from when the Haitians declared independence to then the occupation in the early 1900s, and then fast forward to the 90s and the Clinton administration, and then the implementation of the dry feet policy for Cubans at the same time that Haitians were also coming over. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we have, you know, we've got in the early 1900s and around 1915 is when the U.S. first occupied Haiti. Back then, that was the earliest occupation, and it went for about 20 years into the 1930s. And then you can see in what you just referenced, the difference in treatment between Cubans and Haitians. So during that time, because of the ideological war with Cuba, when they were coming to the US, or when they were attempting to come to the US, they were essentially welcomed with open arms. They were, you know, able to come to the US. They were welcomed. They had resources. They had a whole infrastructure set up to ensure that they could come and not just arrive in the US, but also integrate fully into society. So it's really interesting when you look at then the response toward Haitians, where instead of welcoming Haitians with open arms, and it has to be noted that the two countries there's proximity there. They're not too far from each other. So they were actually sent back. The Coast Guard was deployed to turn boats around with Haitians on them back to Haiti. They were very aggressively prevented from even making that journey. It is the exact opposite of the way that Cubans were treated. And that continues actually till this day. I mean, we continue to see policies coming out of the several U.S. administrations, whether Democratic or Republican, that continue to be anti-Black and that treat Cuban migrants 100% different from individuals and families coming from Haiti to the U.S.
Yeah, I think it's so important to make note. It's been Republicans and Democrats, and actually, so under Clinton, a Democrat, we get this very zero tolerance policy against Haitian migrants. And then in 2015, 2016, while Obama was still in office, he actually instituted what we now call the metering at the border, which is that people had to get a number to get access to asylum, to go ask for asylum, when obviously you're running for your life. You know, how did that policy come about, and what's been its impact up until now?
Well, yeah, I mean, just as you said, it was very much in use in the Clinton administration, but under the current administration, they were still using metering. And what it does is it essentially creates it's another barrier for individuals to be able to get into the country. Because if you're getting a number and then they're going back to where they came from. So if they're going back into Mexico, or if they're going wherever they were before they got to the US border, and it's almost like take a number and good luck, right? And we already know that the process of seeking asylum is very lengthy, that you know, it's not a smooth or fast process. So what metering does is it's just another way of sifting through who is coming into the US, which of course creates avenues for some of that anti-Black racism to show up. And then it prolongs the process and makes it extremely difficult for people who are, in many instances, in desperate conditions to get to the U.S. for asylum.
Right. And then now what we're seeing is, so one is I want to just make note that this policy that actually was of metering was implemented towards Haitian migrants, was tested on Haitian migrants, and then expanded and it was already happening when the caravans, the massive Central American caravans, were coming in through the southern border. And then so that people, there was a 3-week wait time, and then it expanded to 6 weeks, and then 3 months. And then in 2020, COVID hits, right? And what happened to all these people who were waiting to come over and waiting their turn to legally ask, to exercise their right for asylum?
Yeah, well, I mean, so we had the additional delays because of the metering system. So you're now starting to see clusters of people, and, they're not going all the way back to in Central and South America where they came necessarily. So they're beginning to find places to camp out and to stay as they wait for this process to play out. And then we had under the Trump administration, Title 42, which was actually a measure that was put in place under the guise of being a public health measure. But what it did is it allowed the Border Patrol to actually turn people away under the guise that because of COVID, they can't come in and we don't know if they have COVID or not. And so it was an excuse to basically turn them away at the border, and they did not have an opportunity even to seek asylum. And so that policy, Title 42, continues under the Biden administration. They continue to use that policy as a means of turning people away at the border. And so it's one of the things that we've been lifting up, ending that Title 42, because they can. But it's been used, again, as a way to deter people from coming into the country. And in this case, to make sure that none of these Haitian and other Black migrants can actually make it into the United States.
Yeah, this morning I was on a briefing, and one of the activists who's working with Haitian migrants said that it's not a deterrent, even the deportations. They're getting deported, landing in Haiti, and then coming right back in, right? Because the situation is not tenable for them.
Yeah, I mean, it's just really the lack of humanity in our current immigration policy is what's astounding. I mean, even as we think about what's happened in Haiti just in the last several months, right? So the president, Moise, was assassinated in early July. About a month later, there was a major earthquake. A few days after that, there was a tropical storm. And this is against the backdrop of a lot of political unrest around elections and security issues with violence and all of these things that have been longstanding issues. And so the notion of turning people back to go back there, it is inhumane. And even President Biden had made statements about how the conditions in Haiti, and yet and still we saw them actually not just putting them on flights, but actually accelerating the number of flights that were flying out because they wanted to clear the optics of what it looked like to have these thousands of people camped out in Texas at the southern border.
Right. In terms of what's going on in Haiti, I mean, the U.S., Aristide was a democratically elected president. There was a coup against him. What role, in terms of analysis, what role, if any, is the U.S. played in the last assassination of the last president of Haiti?
Well, it's still been unclear. It was a very convoluted set of circumstances when it happened, and even for us at Diaspora Rising, we had been engaged in Haiti for quite some time before everything happened and during the summer. And so there were just a lot of things going on with the constitutional crisis, essentially, with the president disputing the end of his term, when his term was going to be up. And then we had this assassination in which there were individuals from Colombia that were apparently involved, where there were allegations of gang, almost like warlords involved. And so it was a very convoluted situation. But what we do know is that the U.S. has a history of meddling in the affairs of Haiti and the Haitian people. The U.S. supported the Duvalier dictatorships. the U.S. has engaged in meddling in Haiti for years, and has had a hand in some of what is manifesting now as instability. That is a legacy of U.S. interference, historical interference in Haiti. There's a direct line to the current unrest that we saw even prior to the president's assassination. And when we speak with Haitians and those that we engage with on ground, one of the biggest rallying cries is to be self-determining, to be able to exist as self-determining, self-actualized people in their own country without the influence of the US, without the meddling of the US, of France, of Canada, which often flies under the radar. And so that has not happened. And it's why it's really important when we talk about the current challenges that Haiti faces, that we don't sort of minimize it to just, oh, it's just unstable there, or they just have, climate issues, which they do. But there's been intentional interference, intentional meddling, plus foreign policy that has created the circumstances and exacerbated already tenuous circumstances there.
Yeah, I love that you also include climate change, and one is like our bigger global reality in terms of climate change and disaster, but also when it was occupied and and subsequent, like, it has devastated the land in Haiti. So it's not as if people can subsist off the land at this point in a lot of cases.
Yes, and that's one of the things that's often overlooked. So just broadly speaking, Haiti and as well as other countries in the global South, for example, are the least contributors to the climate crisis, yet they're bearing the brunt. Part of that is because how Haiti is situated geographically, but it is also a product of what happens with extractive economies, and this is where we see the residue of imperialism, where the same considerations for land and sustainability have never been in place there, because these countries are seen as mechanisms for profit, to extract resources for the benefit of whether it's the US, France, or whomever else. And so you see that in soil degradation. You see that in the inability to build resilient structures in Haiti, the extra vulnerability to tropical storms or hurricanes. And so that additional vulnerability, coupled with the increasing intensity of these disasters, natural disasters that are actually unnatural disasters, it creates a very tenuous, very precarious situation for Haitians. And that's part of what we're seeing now.
Amara, I wanted to just take a step back and ask you about your organization, Diaspora Rising. Tell us, why was your organization founded? You actually are an international organization. Why did you found this organization? What are you all doing?
Yeah, so Diaspora Rising is fairly new, but it came about as sort of the realization, and it was founded by Opal Tometi, or Ayo Tometi is her name, and she's one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, but also as someone who's a first generation from an immigrant family. And so the organization was founded because of this recognition of the need for the global Black diaspora to engage and connect in ways that we've not done before. It is essentially an iteration of what it means to be Pan-African, and to recognize that we have to connect with each other, that we have to advocate for the issues that are of our concern, that we have to educate not only ourselves about each other, because the diaspora is incredibly diverse, but we also have to educate the rest of the world about what it means to be Black around the world, and then to amplify the issues that we face wherever we find ourselves. And so what this means for us is that we're connected with Black folks in Colombia that are building power and trying to build not only political power, but build economic power. They're trying to navigate a society that we almost don't see how anti-Blackness manifests there, because notions of race are supposed to be different in Central and South America. And if you actually talk to Black folks there, they'll make it very clear the issues that they're facing. And it's similar issues of state violence, for example, in Brazil, where we also work, is state violence in Nigeria with the NSARS movement that, in fact, this month is the 1 year of the NSARS movement against state violence and the conditions in Nigeria. So Diaspora Rising, we actually harness the entire diaspora. We recognize that we have the commonality of our challenges: imperialism, capitalism, colonialism, but also in our collaboration and coming together, it allows us to develop strategies that recognize the similarities of what we face, but also the strength and the power and the resources that we can harness to address these issues. And as we build these relationships, it only makes us stronger as a whole. So that's the work that we do.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah.
Actually, just to get a little bit deeper in that, and how did you all land on the Free Haiti campaign? Is this your first campaign that you're launching together?
Yeah, so we have a number of campaigns. We have NSARS, we had Free Haiti was a big one, and that's because of how Haiti is situated historically, geographically. There's a significance there because Haiti represents, for the Black diaspora, especially the global Black diaspora, it represents liberation, it represents Black people who are self-actualized, it represents all of the things that we know we are. And also Haiti being situated so in such close proximity to hegemony and imperialism via the United States, we knew that we had to speak up for these Africans that are in the Western Hemisphere, right? Because the lineage to the continent is there. And so because of what Haiti means geographically, politically, symbolically, we wanted to make sure that we were engaged in Haiti in deeper ways.
And who are some of the organizations and leaders that I'm assuming that you're working with folks in Haiti as well as in the United States. Who are some of the players that you're working with?
Yeah, so it's a broad coalition. I mean, there's so many organizations that are doing this work on ground that we've either been intentional about amplifying. Some of them are national, some of them are local. I know in Chicago, for example, which is of significance being founded by a Haitian, there came together maybe about 16 to 20 local Haitian organizations: the Haitian Professional Association, Haitian Nurses Association, the Daughters of Haiti, the Haitian Congress. And so even in Chicago, it was working with all of those groups that are home country groups, if you will, that have come together to address the issues in their home country. But we also nationally, there's the Haitian Bridge Alliance, which is doing direct service work at the border and has been doing for years. Before a couple of weeks ago, they've been deeply involved in that work. We also have nationally, Black Alliance for Just Immigration has been doing this work for years. In fact, they put out a report, I believe around 2018, that talked about the migration patterns, that talked about the current border policy, current immigration policy, and what we should be advocating for. So those are just a few of the organizations. There's also groups in DC, Haitian American Professionals Association, that have organized and are doing work on ground. And actually in October 11th, that entire week, they're doing a week of action. The Black Alliance for Just Immigration is sort of organizing a week of action that everyone across the country will hopefully be supporting.
Right. And my understanding too is that while this has happened to Haitian migrants, there's actually a bigger call to really, hey, let's talk about Black migrants and the treatment that they're receiving. The time that I've spent in Mexico, every Black migrant is considered a Haitian, which is not true.
Right.
You know?
Absolutely. That what people don't understand. And so we always try to say Haitian and other Black migrants because there are folks from Congo coming. There are folks from Somalia, folks from Cameroon that are making that journey. And so there's the notion that it's just Haitians. And also there's a misconception that they're just like getting on a boat and landing in Texas. And that's also not the case. So a lot of these Black migrants are coming even from African countries and making that journey through South America, through Central America, then getting to Mexico. And so it's a mix. And you'll typically see where there are areas of conflict. So there is conflict right now in Congo. There is conflict right now in Cameroon. And so you'll see individuals from those countries that are part of the Black migrants that are making their way to the US border, or just you'll find them in different South and Central American countries. And it's really important to note that the policies are anti-Black generally. So it's not just Haitians, but you'll find that they're all caught up under that label.
Right, right. And that the US is also paying Mexico to deport Black migrants and Central Americans before they even hit that border.
Yes.
Right. That's something nobody's talking about. And in terms of how Haitians are actually stuck in Tapachula in their journey up south, they get stuck there for months or maybe sometimes a year.
Yes.
And are not allowed to travel up to the border, which is their right.
Yes. And we showed a documentary that was done by Jimmy Jean-Louis, he's a Haiti ambassador at large, but he's also an actor, has been very vocal. He did this documentary in 2016, but it could have been done last week. Right. And he talked to Haitians who were stuck in Tapachula, who were just getting, having these barriers put up at so many instances on the journey. And a lot of it is the result of U.S. foreign policy, which has been to say, cut them off before they even get to the southern border. And the same anti-Black policies that they're using at the southern border are also used in those countries that are on the way to coming to the southern border. And also it's to say that many of these countries, in Brazil, for example, and Chile, they actually recruited Haitians to come to their country as laborers. So around the Olympics, Brazil was aggressively recruiting, Chile as well. And what happened is, as the economy shifted, all of a sudden it became very untenable for Haitians and other Black migrants to be in those countries. So they were compelled to leave. And that's when many of them journeyed to the southern border. So there's something to be said about what the conditions were in those countries that were so untenable that these Black migrants had to now make an additional journey up to the US border looking for a better life.
Correct. And risking their life in doing that because, their lives were not safe. As we wrap up, I would love to hear from you. What are the demands coming from? I know there's a wide coalition of different organizations. What are some of the immediate demands and some of the more long-term demands that Diaspora Rising is demanding?
Yeah, so we're definitely amplifying the demands of our Haitian-led organizations. And I didn't even mention down in South Florida, the Black Collective has been doing just amazing work with the Haitian community, both here and in Haiti. And so we're really lifting up the demands that they have made. The immediate demands were stopping the deportations, right? Immediately. Now, what the administration did was they actually accelerated the number of flights to hurry up and rush everyone out from under the bridge because the optics were bad. But we're calling for halting the deportations in the immediate, that individuals should be able to come here and to seek asylum because the US is actually violating not only its own laws, but it's violating international law as well when it doesn't allow people to come and seek asylum. So halting the deportations is the immediate, but we're also calling for revoking that Title 42 to not use Title 42 as a mechanism or an excuse to prevent individuals and families from coming and seeking asylum in the US. The metering process is something that we talked about earlier. That process is being used to delay and to select those who the US wants to handpick to be able to get into the country. Also, just this notion of, an immigration policy that includes Black voices. So often Black people are excluded from or invisibilized when it comes to the immigration debate. And this is even within the immigration rights community, right? So there's even this sort of anti-Black or just invisible or erasure of Black immigrants when it comes to immigration policy. And so we really have to center the voices of Black immigrants who do face additional challenges because of the US policy, because of how they're treated by the criminal legal system. There's so many compounding issues when it comes to Black immigrants and Black migrants that we have to make sure that those voices are amplified locally, but definitely at the federal level. And so that's something that just moving forward, we have to be very clear about, and to acknowledge that every administration has dropped the ball on immigration.
Right.
Every administration, Democratic or Republican. This is an issue that has gone on for a very long time, and we have to keep calling it out. And we cannot let this administration hide under rhetoric of racial equity and being welcoming without actually following through in substance and in action.
Yeah, I want to thank you for your time and also just acknowledge the groups that you mentioned and I'm sure there's a lot more. And want to say too that the the organizing that has happened with Haitian communities and other Black migrants has also helped us win TPS, the extension of TPS, which is not the answer, but it is relief for a lot of folks who also even came recently. So, and that only happened because of the organizing. So I think that that's important to applaud and to uplift, because this is a hard struggle. So we got to also celebrate those wins and bringing people together. So thank you so much, Amara, for joining us today. It was really a pleasure to speak with you. For our viewers, thank you for joining us today. It was great to be with you all. Please catch us next Wednesday at 4 p.m. Pacific. That's 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern time. All right. Thanks, everybody. We enjoyed having you on the show. Thank you, Amara. You have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much.